So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our Girls Brigade for indeed putting that worship song together this morning. That was amazing. And so I want to say a massive thank you to them. Richard's going to read our reading for this morning, and indeed it's that reading of the feeding of the 5,000. Richard.
John chapter 6, beginning at the first verse, Jesus feeds 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he had already in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. This is the word of the Lord.
So Richard, thank you for reading that passage. Let's look at it together. The disciples have been away from Jesus on their very first mission. Try and imagine how excited they must have been on returning. Peter wants to tell how people listened. John wants to tell how people were healed as he prayed with them. They're bursting to share with Jesus what God has done through them. But because of the crowds, they can't get a chance. And so Jesus wants to take them away to a quiet place where in his presence they can be refreshed, renewed and strengthened. It's really lovely how spending time getting close to Jesus can refresh and strengthen your heart and your spirit. And so they try to get away by boat to a place across the lake, way out of town, far from everywhere. The only problem is, of course, the crowds aren't easy to lose. That sets the scene for both the disciples and us to see and experience a miracle that reveals the very heart and the very nature of what God is like. The miracle is a window through which our God shows us more of himself in his Son Jesus. So the first thing I want to say this morning is the compassionate heart of Jesus. You know how good we are at hiding it when someone annoys us or even frustrates us. And Jesus has every reason to be annoyed with this crowd who won't give him a minute's peace. But we get an insight into Jesus' heart and feelings. And we're told in another gospel account of the same event that he had compassion because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. If you leave sheep without a shepherd, they end up running here, there, everywhere. They are directionless, lost, and they often end up hurting others or getting hurt themselves. And Jesus looks at this crowd with X-ray eyes. He sees their hearts. He sees they are needy people, spiritually hungry, with not just empty stomachs, but with empty hearts and empty lives. And as we look out across our world today, which has left God behind, what do we see? Lost, bewildered, directionless people who are trying to make their way through life's confusing maze. And so many of them are hurting. And here twice in verses 2 and 5, there's this emphasis on a great crowd of people who are coming and searching for Jesus. You know, when Jesus looks at our lives, he always looks below the surface. He looks into our hearts, our needs, our struggles. There are people in this crowd in John chapter 6 with broken hearts, broken hopes, broken dreams. And when Jesus saw these people, it stirred such strong feelings and passion within him. His heart flows out to them, and he does something in response. He teaches them through a miracle what he and his Father are truly like. The one quality that undergirds everything Jesus does with people is his compassion and his tender mercy. You know, one of the most important things you could ever ask God for, if you want to be like him and be used by him, Lord, share your heart with me, your heart of compassion and tender mercy for people in need, that I might reach out to them, to witness, to pray, to love, to care for them. We are surrounded by so many people in such need. And we need to share God's tender heart, that we too will be stirred to action and response. The second thing, the short-sightedness of the disciples. I'm always amazed at how honest the disciples are painted in the Gospels. You see them warts and all. Matthew, in his account, in Matthew 14, extends a conversation that Jesus had with the disciples, and he gives us a little flavour of it. In Matthew 14, verse 15, it says, as evening approached, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This is a remote place, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy some food." And Jesus' reply is, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You see, the disciples are getting anxious here. Look, Jesus, there's nowhere we're going to get that kind of food that is needed for this crowd. And Philip's from this area. He would have known where the local shops were. And so Jesus asked him the question in verse 5, where shall we buy food for these people to eat? This is very short notice. There doesn't seem to be an obvious, practical, immediate solution. Philip is baffled. And Philip's answer is one of just complete despair and desperation. Buy something to eat, Jesus? Feed these people? Like, look at the numbers. Well, 8 months' wages wouldn't be enough to give them a bite, never mind a meal. And Jesus asks, where are we going to get food to feed these people? But Philip's reply is more this, Lord, it doesn't matter where, because we can't do it anyway. We couldn't afford it. We don't have what it takes to meet these needs. Lord, this is out of our league. And when Jesus asks Philip, where are they going to get enough food to feed these people? He doesn't ask because he doesn't know. Because John makes it plain. Because he adds this, that Jesus already knew the answer. He was asking in order to see how Philip would respond. What was Jesus looking for from Philip here? He was looking for a response of faith. Philip couldn't see with the human eye the need in front of him, how food could be bought at a moment's notice to feed 5,000 plus people. And so instead of responding with faith, he reacted with fear and panic. And let's be honest, it's all too easy to look at the size of the challenge and from a human perspective, just sink. Folks, do you ever get overwhelmed by the needs of people around the world? Everywhere we look in the world today, there are huge crowds of people, so many needs, there is so much pain at this time. And sometimes, if we're honest, we feel like these disciples, because their reaction is our reaction if we're honest. They just want Jesus to take the problem off their hands, out of their sight. And immediately, the disciples are faced with such an enormous need. The disciples look out on the crowd with despair. They're totally inadequate. The resources are totally inadequate to meet such a need as this. This is way beyond us. We can't do anything here. The disciples can only see what is humanly possible. They see the people, they recognize the need that's there, but when they look around, they can't find the resources to match that need. The demand is outstripping supply. But if they had the eyes of faith, they could see what is possible when God breaks in. Jesus says to the disciples in Matthew's account, Matthew 14, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Thirdly and finally, the willingness of Jesus to use the little that we offer him. The disciples here are saying we can't do anything, we simply don't have what it takes. Well, what do they have? Very little. Well, what can they do? Well, Philip is awestruck by the size of the need confronting him in verse 7. Andrew comes in verse 8 and he speaks up and he says in verse 9, here's a boy, a little boy, with 5 small baps and 2 small fish. And the whole contrast is between the great crowd and these small, totally inadequate resources. This is a small boy, small lunch, small baps, small fish, small offering. 5,000 plus people. Scholars believe that something like 15 to 20,000 people that day were to be fed, because in those days they only took a head count of the men, and it was the men in the crowd that brought the number to 5,000, but there were women and there were children there. And Jesus takes and he uses this shy, insignificant little boy with so little to offer. The boy has brought his packed lunch in his long walk to meet Jesus. And now this same boy willingly hands over his meal. He doesn't hold on to it tightly, but he gives it away. And Jesus takes that one little boy who is willing to offer all that he has, and look at what he is able to do. How often again do we use that as an excuse not to offer to Jesus, not to give to Jesus, not to serve Jesus? Oh Lord, I wouldn't be any good at that. Lord, I couldn't do this. Lord, I would be useless at that. But Lord, I could only offer a little time, a little this, a little that. Take it all, although it's small, give it over completely to Jesus. And it doesn't matter how little you feel you have, as long as you're willing to give it all to Jesus. Folks, there's no telling how Jesus could use you if you take a big risk and offer him a small thing in your life. What must have been going through the disciples' minds when they're organizing these people to receive? We often think of the miracle taking place in Jesus' hands, but something else happened, because he divides the 5 loaves and the 2 fish between the 12 disciples, and he says to them, now go and feed them. And as they give out the little that they had in their hands, they found that there was always more to give away. You may think that what you can do for God is very little, but the more you do those little things, take those little opportunities, the more God will increase and multiply the ways in which he will use you. Only God can do miracles, but he does them through the hands of Christians who are willing to reach out in faith to be used by him. And just look at the results, verse 11. All of them ate and were full, were satisfied. Their stomachs were full. God provided all they needed with a little extra. Verse 13. There were only 5 barley loaves to start with, but 12 baskets were filled with the pieces of bread the people did not eat. There was more than enough. It actually means that they had eaten until they were completely full. And Jesus tells the disciples to gather up the remaining food so that nothing is wasted. You know, when they do so, as I said, they fill 12 baskets. These 12 disciples now have their own individual picnics. But folks, who can fill and satisfy the emptiness that people feel so strongly inside them today? I want to say only Jesus, only he can do this. Verse 35, Jesus replied, I am the bread of life. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry again. So what's the lessons from this story this morning as these people encountered Jesus? It's a lesson about faith, isn't it? That I honestly believe that there are so many little ways that any Christian can be used by God on any day. Little things can have a powerful impact in God's hands. And God's heart is always to use his people to reach out and love and care for people around us every day. So often we miss those opportunities because we keep looking at ourselves and our littleness rather than at God and his greatness. Lord, it's not what I can't do, it's what you can do in and through me that's going to count. Let me finish with this story. You probably have heard me tell this story before, but I love it. It's about a guy called Albert McMacken. He was 24 years of age. He was a farmer who recently had come to faith in Jesus. He was so full of enthusiasm that he filled a truck with people and he took them to a Christian meeting to hear about Jesus. There was a good-looking farmer's son whom he was especially keen to get to the meeting. But this young man was hard to persuade. He was busy falling in and out of love with different girls and didn't seem to be attracted to Christianity. But eventually, Albert McMacken managed to persuade him to come by asking him to drive the truck. When they arrived, Albert's guest decided to go in, and he was spellbound at that meeting. He began to have thoughts he had never known before. He went back again and again to the meeting until one night he went forward and he gave his life to Jesus Christ. That man, the driver of the truck, was Billy Graham. The year was 1934. Since then, we know that Billy Graham's ministry led thousands of people to faith in Jesus. We cannot all be like Billy Graham, but we can be like Albert McMacken. We can bring our friends to Jesus. Folks, does that story create a response in your heart? Lord, if you can use one little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish to touch 5,000 plus people, Lord, if you could use Albert McMacken in a very simple way, Lord, you could use me. But folks, if only you see the feeding of the 5,000 and don't see anything more than that, then you've missed the whole reason of this miracle. This is about Jesus. He is the bread of life. He is the one who fills and satisfies the deepest longings of our hearts and our lives. He is the one who meets the deepest spiritual longings and the desires that go on within our hearts. This little boy, I think, is an amazing character because he surrenders all. He gives all. He hands over all to Jesus. And in Jesus' hands, with the Father's blessing, this amazing miracle takes place. And thousands of men and women, our children, are fed. Not just fed, but they are filled, they are satisfied. Because Jesus is God's Son. And because He has come to live right inside my little life, now I can say, God can. You know those words, Philippians 4:13. I can do everything with the help of Jesus who gives me the strength that I need. Does that cause a response within you? Does that stir excitement as it did that day as Jesus fed those people? People who encountered Jesus. Have you? Well, here's Ben to tell us about his encounter and indeed his journey of faith at this moment as he journeys through lockdown. Ben.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben. I bumped into Arthur on one of my walks the other day and he asked me to talk about my faith in lockdown for a minute or two. I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember and I've been going to church since I was just a small boy, but I am by no means a perfect Christian, far from it in fact. And if there's one thing I've been guilty of during lockdown, it's sometimes failing to pray as often as I should. But to help me, I have a list of Bible verses in this wee loaf of bread. The bread of life is what it's called. I pick out these Bible verses each day and sometimes they'll really help. But there's another problem that I've noticed with me that isn't necessarily the fault of lockdown. It's taking things for granted. I've noticed that I have a lot of things to be thankful for. And before lockdown, I've taken them all for granted. It's things like being able to go to school, see my family, and eat lunch with friends. And as much as I say I dislike school, I've come to miss it a bit. And so I'm making it my goal to try and be thankful for the things that I have around me and be thankful to God for giving them to me. Thanks for listening.